They never believed in me, not once. I'm Rachel Collins. I'm 33 years old and I've been wearing a military uniform for the last 11 years. Today, that uniform is hanging in the back of my SUV, zipped inside a garment bag metals tucked in tight like secrets no one back home ever wanted to hear. I hadn't set foot in this town for over 7 years. The roads hadn't changed, just more cracks in the pavement and more rust on the mailbox at the corner where the gas station used to be. I was heading back to my childhood home in northern Texas, a stretch of land so flat you could see forever and still feel completely unseen. The sky was an endless gray, and the fields rolled by like a forgotten movie. My fingers gripped the wheel tighter the closer I got, as if my body remembered what my mind tried to forget. That house never felt like home, just a place filled with closed doors and colder shoulders. My parents never really understood why I chose the military. They thought it was just a detour, something I'd grow out of. My brother Chris followed the script, joined the company my father works at, bought a house, married well, got promoted fast. I got promoted too, more than once. But in their eyes, I was still the one who left instead of stayed. The one who traded spreadsheets for combat boots, boardrooms for command centers. My rank didn't mean anything to them. The silence after every promotion email said more than words ever could. They didn't come to my pinning ceremonies, didn't ask about my deployments, didn't even answer when I sent photos from overseas. But I kept serving. Not for their approval, not for anyone's. Just because I knew what I was capable of, even if they didn't. The driveway came into view like a place frozen in time. Same cracked concrete, same porch swing leaning to one side, same chipping paint my father always said he'd fix one day. I slowed the car and parked, my heart thudding with a mix of old resentment and something else I couldn't name yet. This wasn't just a visit, it was something more. I wasn't coming back for a holiday or to pretend nothing had happened. I was coming back because the world had changed. I had changed. And soon they were going to see exactly how much. The front door creaked the same way it always had, that sharp metallic groan that used to make me wince when I came home past curfew. The air inside smelled like lemon cleaner and reheated leftovers, like someone trying to scrub the years off something that never really got clean. I stood in the doorway a second longer than I needed to, letting the chill from outside cling to me, because what waited inside didn't feel any warmer. My mother's voice drifted from the kitchen like it hadn't missed a beat. "So, you actually made it this time. I thought you'd change your mind again like last Thanksgiving." I didn't answer right away. Just walked in, suitcase in hand, the edges of my boots still wet from the yard. The living room was exactly the same. Beige walls, beige carpet, and photo frames that told the story they wanted the world to believe. There was Chris at his wedding, Chris shaking hands with the company VP, Chris holding his newborn daughter in a perfectly lit hospital photo. I searched out of habit for the one picture they used to keep of me in uniform when I made captain. It was gone. My mother popped into the hallway, wiping her hands on a towel. She gave me a look that barely registered as a greeting. "Chris will be here soon. He just finished leading a presentation for Argentech's Next Gen initiative. Got a standing ovation. Can you believe that I nodded once, even though I didn't care? It didn't matter. None of it surprised me anymore. I stepped into the kitchen, the same checkered tile and the same crooked clock above the stove. The table was already set for 4, but I knew who the guest of honor would be. My chair was always the one nearest the hallway, like they wanted to keep my exit quick and simple. Mom kept talking like I hadn't been gone 7 years. She went on about Chris's new electric car, how his wife just got promoted, how the baby's already showing signs of being advanced for her age. Not one question about where I'd been stationed. Not one word about my work. Just silence filling every corner where curiosity used to live. I said I'd help with dinner and she waved me off. "No need, I've got it. You probably need to rest after all that traveling." Her words were soft, but her tone was sharp, like the edge of a cold spoon. I didn't argue. I'd learned years ago that arguing here just meant I'd end up lonelier than I started. I carried my bag upstairs to what used to be my room. The walls were still pale blue, still taped with college acceptance letters and cheer squad photos from high school. A few stuffed animals sat on the shelf untouched, like they were waiting for a version of me that no longer existed. It felt like a shrine to someone who never left, someone who never became more than what they wanted her to be. I opened the closet and pushed the hangers aside, making space for the uniform they still didn't know I wore. It settled into place behind an old hoodie, invisible again. Just like me. Downstairs, I heard the front door open and the familiar pitch of Chris's voice. Loud, confident, full of momentum. The kind of voice that fills a room before the person even steps into it. He greeted our parents like he was returning from a summit, not just the office, and they lit up like someone had flipped on a switch. I stayed upstairs a few extra minutes, letting them have their moment. The clink of glasses and the hum of conversation floated up like a distant song I couldn't join. When I finally came down, Chris smiled at me like someone seeing an old high school friend. Wow, didn't expect to see you at this one. Thought you were overseas or something? I said I just had some time and figured I'd visit. That was all they needed to hear. At dinner, my father finally looked up from his phone long enough to mention how important tomorrow's Argon Tech Summit would be. He was prepping to pitch to the board, and if the military assessment went well, they could secure their largest defense contract yet. I asked who was overseeing the military side. He shrugged. No idea. Someone from Washington. High up. Probably a paper pusher. Chris leaned back in his chair and said with a laugh, "Whoever it is better be ready. We're about to blow them away." My mother raised her glass and toasted to his future, to the next generation of leadership. No one looked at me when she said it. I kept eating. Not because I was hungry, but because chewing gave me something to do while they praised each other. They spoke of things I already knew, things I'd reviewed in detail over the past 3 months, things I would be responsible for approving or rejecting tomorrow morning. But tonight I was just Rachel, just the daughter who left, the one whose stories never made the wall, the one who slipped into town like she never belonged in the first place. I unzipped the suitcase, slowly letting the sound fill the silence of the room. The uniform was folded with care, every crease aligned, every thread intact. I pulled it out and laid it across the bed, watching the fabric settle like something alive. The deep navy blue still held its weight not just in fabric, but in memory. The silver eagle pins rested on the collar, sharp and unyielding symbol of a rank I never thought I'd reach this young. Colonel stationed now in D.C. Overseeing operations most people never hear about unless something goes terribly wrong. My fingers brushed over each medal stitched into the chest. I remembered the heat of the desert, the sting of winter wind through combat gear, the endless hours staring at code streams that could save or end lives. Every ribbon told a story, but no one in this house had ever asked to hear one. I held up the jacket to the light and felt its silence. It had traveled across continents through war zones and strategy rooms, into secure facilities where even my name was whispered carefully. And here it hung like a costume no one wanted to see. I thought of the nights I sat alone in barracks writing emails home that were never answered. I remembered scanning the crowd at my first promotion ceremony, searching for a familiar face that never came. I didn't cry then, and I wouldn't now. I wasn't angry. Not anymore. I had stopped needing applause the day I realized I could lead soldiers into missions and bring them all back safely. That meant more than any headline or family photo album. Still standing in my old room, I couldn't pretend it didn't hurt. The silence here wasn't neutral. It was pointed. A quiet way of saying you chose wrong and were not interested in hearing why you think it was right. I slid the uniform into the closet behind an old sweatshirt from my undergrad years. The same school I left after joining ROTC, the same chapter they've spent years pretending, didn't happen. I didn't hide the uniform, I just let it rest for now, like a truth waiting its turn. They didn't need to understand every piece of what I've done. But one day, maybe they'd see the weight it carried. And maybe they'd realize I carried it alone. Chris walked in like he owned the house, grinning wide and tossing his keys on the entry table with practiced flair. He wore a slate gray button-down sleeves rolled just enough to show off a watch that probably cost more than my first car. My parents stood a little straighter the second he appeared, their faces lighting up like someone just flipped on the power. He kissed Mom on the cheek, clapped Dad on the back, then turned to me with that familiar smirk. "Still in uniform, sis. Or did you finally trade in the boots for a real job?" I smiled, politely said I was still serving, and sat down without another word. It wasn't worth correcting him. Dinner was already on the table, pot roast potatoes, and that green bean casserole Mom always made too salty. Chris talked the entire time, going on about his latest project with Argon Tech, some new AI initiative with military potential. He used words like breakthrough and vision and pivot, and every time he paused, someone at the table praised him like he'd discovered gravity. I listened, nodded, chewed, slowly. No one asked what I'd been working on. No one mentioned my field evaluations or the mission briefing I'd led 2 weeks ago. I could have been anyone, a neighbor, a guest, someone who wandered in off the street. At one point, Dad brought up tomorrow's summit at Argon Tech. Said it was a big deal for the company, especially if the military partner gave the green light. Chris chuckled and said he hoped it wasn't some stiff in a starched uniform who didn't get the tech. They all laughed like it was a joke we were supposed to share. I said nothing. I didn't flinch. I just kept eating, letting their words slide over me like water over glass. Every line, every smug comment, every casual dismissal stacked itself quietly in my mind. Mom turned to me and said I looked tired. Maybe it was time to start thinking about something more stable, something with structure and routine, something that wouldn't wear me down year after year. I told her I was fine, that I liked what I did. She nodded, already moving on to a story about Chris's baby learning to count to 10. It was like I didn't exist. Not the way they saw him, not the way they saw each other. But I wasn't hurt. Not this time, because I knew something they didn't. Tomorrow they would learn exactly who the military partner was. And this time, the silence would belong to them. The glass facade of Argon Tech shimmered under the early sun, clean and sharp like everything else about this place. I stepped out of the car, slowly, heels clicking against the pavement, my uniform perfectly pressed silver eagles, catching the light like quiet signals of authority. The security guard at the front gate glanced at my ID, snapped to attention, and called me Colonel without hesitation. The lobby was already buzzing with soft conversation suits, moving from coffee stations to elevator slides, being prepped for the big pitch. No one recognized me at first, just another official in government blues. The elevator doors opened to the 12th floor, and the quiet changed. My heels echoed against polished stone as I walked down the hallway, not fast, not slow, just steady. I passed glass offices and nodding staff, and the closer I got to the conference room, the more heads started to turn. Chris was standing near the far wall with his tablet running through a mock pitch for two other team members. He looked up mid-sentence and saw me. His expression faltered. One blink, then another. His lips parted like he wanted to speak, but couldn't form a sound. I kept walking. My father stepped into the hallway from the corner break room, coffee in hand, mid-conversation with a senior engineer. He saw me too. His steps stopped. The cup didn't fall, but he gripped it tighter, knuckles whitening. He scanned the collar, the ribbons, the name stitched cleanly across the chest. Rachel Collins. The conference doors opened ahead of me. I stepped inside. The CEO, Elaine Tran, turned from the screen and smiled like she'd been waiting for me. She extended her hand without hesitation. "What an honor to have you here in person, Colonel Collins." I took her hand and nodded once. I felt it was important to be present for a full evaluation. Her voice lifted as she turned to the room. "Everyone, allow me to introduce Colonel Rachel Collins, the Senior Department of Defense representative, overseeing the Argon Tech Defense Systems Initiative." The room fell silent. Not quiet, silent, chairs stilled. Laptops sat open, untouched. Every head turned toward me. My mother, seated in the second row behind my father, covered her mouth with one hand. Chris slowly lowered his tablet, eyes fixed on me like he'd never really seen me until now. Elaine continued speaking, explaining that all strategic approvals, budget releases, and final compliance sign-offs would go through my desk. She said my presence marked a new chapter of accountability and partnership. I didn't have to say anything. The silence was doing all the work. I took my seat near the front, directly across from the presentation screen. My name was already printed on the placard. No longer a guest, no longer invisible. Now the one with the final word. The air inside the room felt heavier now, like something had shifted that no one could quite name. My father stood frozen near the back, his mouth slightly open, eyes darting between me and the placard in front of my seat. Chris was still clutching his tablet arms, stiff fingers gripping too tight, like if he let go, the ground might move under him. No one spoke. Not at first. There was a kind of stunned stillness, the kind that only comes when the version of reality you've known gets rewritten in a single breath. I sat quietly, opened my laptop, and began pulling up the evaluation files, like this was any other assignment. Elaine returned to the agenda, her voice steady, guiding the room forward as if this kind of moment happened every day. I didn't look back at my family. I didn't need to. Their silence told me everything. My father finally moved to a seat near the far end of the table. Chris followed slower than usual, his face blank. They sat down without speaking, without looking at me, the weight of the moment pressing down on whatever pride they'd carried into the room. I adjusted the screen brightness and clicked into the project dashboard. The numbers glowed back at me, charts, compliance data, vulnerability notes. I had reviewed it all. I knew the system better than anyone here. Across the table, a man from the tech team cleared his throat and asked if we would begin soon. Elaine nodded and turned to me. Colonel Collins, the floor is yours. I stood calm and measured, voice clear, but never raised. The summit had begun, and no one in that room had any doubt who was leading it. The auxiliary conference room was smaller, quieter, tucked away from the polished glass and formal lighting of the main floor. I stepped inside to find them already there. My mother sat with her purse clenched in her lap, back stiff, eyes darting to the floor. My father stood by the window, arms folded, staring out at nothing. Chris leaned against the far wall, arms crossed, face tight. No one spoke until I shut the door behind me. My mother was the first to break the silence. Her voice was soft, but the question cut sharp. How long have you been involved in this project? I told her 6 months. I'd been overseeing it from the Pentagon since Phase 2 began. My father turned around slowly. You never said a word, not one. His voice wasn't angry, just stunned. I kept my tone level. I sent updates. After each promotion, every time I moved, I invited you to my pinning ceremonies. No one replied. Chris straightened, scoffing. That's not fair. You ambushed us. You walked into that room knowing exactly how this would land. I looked at him steady. It wasn't about ambushing anyone. I was doing my job. You just didn't expect me to be the one doing it. My mother shifted in her seat, fingers twisting her rings. You could have warned us, Rachel, given us a heads up. Maybe we could have. She trailed off, eyes losing focus like the sentence had nowhere to land. I didn't respond. There was nothing I could have said that they would have heard before today. Chris stepped forward, voice rising just enough to show the edge under his words. You made us look like fools. In front of the board. In front of the CEO. That's what this was about, right? Showing us up. I met his eyes, calm but unflinching. No, it was never about you. You led one department. I oversee the entire contract. I didn't do this to prove a point. I did it because it was assigned to me, because I earned it. My father finally pulled out a chair and sat down slowly. His expression cracked just slightly. I thought the military was a phase. I thought you'd come back to something more stable, something safer. He looked tired, maybe even ashamed. I nodded once. I know. You never believed this was a career. You believed it was a detour, something I'd grow out of. But I didn't, and I shouldn't have had to convince you. My mother looked at me with wet eyes. I didn't mean to make you feel small. I just wanted what I thought was best. I didn't say anything back. The room was already full of words that had come too late. We sat in silence for a moment, not peaceful, not hostile, just suspended like we were all waiting for the weight of the truth to settle where it belonged. I looked at them and spoke plainly. I've spent 11 years serving this country. Not once have I asked for applause or attention, but I did hope just once to be seen. I told them about the nights I spent in desert outposts tracing cyber attacks through layers of stolen code, about the hours no one counted, the deployments they never asked, about the lives I helped protect without ever making a sound. I mentioned the promotion to major, the one they never replied to even after I sent the photo and the invite. Chris shifted in his chair, the defensiveness draining from his face. He didn't speak yet, but his eyes softened. I told them about the ceremony at the Pentagon, the one where General Grant herself pinned the silver eagle on my collar. Every other family in the room had someone waiting with a camera. I had a colleague take the photo for me. My voice didn't crack. I kept it steady, because I needed them to hear every word without flinching. I told them how I used to replay that silence over and over, wondering if I had made it all up, if what I'd done meant anything outside the walls I worked in. My mother covered her mouth like she was trying to hold something in. Her hands trembled, and she whispered that she never realized how far away she'd pushed me. I said nothing. It wasn't a moment for rescue. My father sat forward, elbows on his knees, eyes lowered. He said he was wrong, that he spent years waiting for me to come back to something familiar, that he didn't understand what I was building because it didn't look like what he knew. Then he looked up and said he was proud and that he was sorry. I nodded, not as acceptance, but as acknowledgement. His words mattered more now than they would have back then, but I also knew they wouldn't erase what had already passed. Chris leaned his arms on the table and said he never saw me this way before. He said he thought I had just gone off the grid and stayed busy, but now he realized he'd never asked the right questions. I didn't say it was okay, because it wasn't, but I did tell him I was open to starting over if that's what he really wanted. My mother reached across the table slowly and placed her hand on mine. Her voice cracked when she asked if I could forgive her. I didn't answer right away. I just looked at her and let her sit in the question the way I had sat in silence for years. It wasn't easy. None of it would be. But for the first time, I felt like they were really listening. And that alone made the moment feel different, real. Something like a beginning. I first mentioned the military over dinner my sophomore year of college. I had found a brochure for the ROTC scholarship program and placed it on the table like it meant something. My father glanced at it once, then looked back at his plate. He said the military was for people with no other options, that I didn't need to throw away my future just to chase some uniform. My mother smiled weakly and changed the subject to Chris's internship interview the next morning. I didn't push back. I just folded the brochure and tucked it into my backpack. But my decision was already made. 3 months later, I began training. Fort Leonard Wood was colder than I expected. Wet air soaked through the first layer of everything, and the mornings felt like punishment. I wasn't stronger than the others, not faster, but I didn't break. Every push-up came with a name I wanted to prove wrong. Every mile I ran felt like moving further from the version of myself they expected to see. I finished in the top 10% of my class and was commissioned as a second lieutenant with honors. I sent a picture home, standing straight right hand, raised oath mid-sentence, full uniform. No one replied. A week later, my father posted a photo of Chris shaking hands with the VP of Argonne Tech. He called it a proud moment for the family. Still, I kept writing. After my first deployment, I emailed a letter saying I was safe. I included a short story about helping secure a compromised network in a joint command post. I never got a response. I checked my inbox every day for 2 weeks. During my third year, I was transferred to Cyber Command after discovering a vulnerability in our internal system that could have exposed troop locations. That detection prevented a breach. It made the official reports. My name was listed next to it. I sent a copy home. Nothing came back. So I stopped sending, not out of spite, just survival. There was only so long you could keep extending a hand into a room that never reached back. I focused harder. I earned promotions. I got better. I took advanced courses in encryption, AI systems, defense protocols. I learned to work under pressure and to be the one people turned to when things went wrong. I developed a rhythm, and that rhythm kept me going. But every so often, I'd scroll through the family group chat that was still active without me. Photos of barbecues, new cars, birthday candles. I wasn't angry, not exactly, but I did feel the weight of being quietly erased. There was a night in Utah I'll never forget. An internal breach triggered alarms across the West Coast base. For 36 hours straight, I worked with a skeleton crew to isolate and contain the threat. No one outside the command center even knew how close it had come. We stopped it cold. The next morning, I sat on the edge of my bunk, pulled out my phone, and hovered over my father's contact. My thumb paused, then retreated. I knew he'd still be more impressed if Chris had installed a new server in his office. Some wounds don't bleed. They just live there stitched into your breath, showing up in quiet ways. I didn't chase recognition anymore. I chased readiness. And that in time became enough. But sometimes in the silence that followed each success, I still wondered what it would have felt like to be seen. Not for what I could have been, but for what I already was. The apartment smelled like roasted vegetables and fresh bread. The table was set for 4, nothing fancy, just clean plates and folded napkins the way I always did it when I wanted things to feel intentional. I'd lit a candle in the middle, not for mood, but for warmth. It was the first time I'd invited them over. No holiday, no announcement, just dinner. A simple invitation sent with no expectations. My father arrived first. He held something wrapped in brown paper and tape, awkward in his hands like he didn't know what to do with it. I took it from him gently and peeled the wrapping away. Inside was a framed article from Defense Today with my name in bold across the top and a photo of me shaking hands with General Grant at the ArcTech launch event. He cleared his throat and said he had the original hanging in his office. This one was for me. I didn't say much, just nodded and led him inside. My mother came next carrying a red tin I hadn't seen in years. I knew the smell before she said anything. Apple cinnamon pie, my favorite growing up. She smiled a little unsure and said she used the same recipe but with less sugar, since I was probably eating cleaner these days. I took the tin and placed it on the table next to the salad. She glanced around the apartment like she was trying to memorize it. Her eyes landed on a small bookshelf filled with folders and field manuals, and for once she didn't flinch at the sight of them. Chris and his wife came last. He wore jeans and a plain button down, and for once no smugness followed him through the door. He brought a bottle of red wine and said it was one I'd probably like. He looked different somehow, smaller, calmer. Dinner was quiet at first, just the usual questions about how work was, how the city had changed. But then Chris asked about zero trust frameworks in cyber defense, said he was trying to revise a proposal for his team and wasn't sure how to justify a budget reallocation. I looked at him for a second, surprised, then offered a few suggestions. He pulled out a small notebook and wrote them down. My mother listened closely, nodding, even when she didn't quite understand. My father asked how often threat simulation was required for high-clearance projects. No one interrupted. No one shifted the conversation back to promotions or stock prices. We cleared the plate slowly, the way people do when they don't want to break something fragile. As I poured coffee, Chris said he'd been following some of my papers. Said he admired how I made something so complex feel grounded. I didn't know how to respond, so I just said thank you. After dessert, my mother looked at me and said she never imagined I'd grow into someone so deeply sure of herself. She said she still didn't understand the full scope of what I did, but she wanted to learn. I didn't need her to understand everything. Just that she asked was enough. As the evening faded and coats were gathered, my father lingered by the door. He looked around the apartment and said it felt like me, like someone who built something solid, quiet, and strong. I placed the framed article on a side table near the window. The last bit of sunlight caught the glass, reflecting just enough to light the headline. For the first time, it didn't feel like I was proving anything. It just felt like I was home. The doorbell rang just as the last of the dishes were cleared. I opened it to find General Grant standing there, still in civilian clothes, but with the presence of someone who never had to say who she was. She held a bottle of champagne and smiled, like the visit was nothing more than a long overdue favor. "Sorry I'm late," she said. "Got caught in a meeting at the Pentagon, but I told them this one mattered more." I stepped aside to let her in, and the room shifted the second she entered. My father stood almost instinctively, straightening his posture like muscle memory. He reached out his hand, the words barely catching up to him. "It's an honor to meet you, General." She shook it firmly and said she'd heard plenty about him too, mostly from me. My mother offered her a seat with a nervous smile, then asked if she liked apple pie, her voice softer than usual. General Grant said it was her favorite, and the ease in her answer calmed something in the room. The tension faded, replaced by a kind of quiet curiosity. We sat down again, and the conversation turned to stories from deployment leadership decisions, near misses that never made the news. My father listened closely, asking follow-up questions with genuine interest. He wasn't trying to impress. He was trying to understand. My mother leaned in when General Grant described the early days of cyber warfare and how Rachel had been the first to spot a particular breach pattern that no one else had seen. "You're saying Rachel caught that before it spread?" Her voice held a new kind of wonder. General Grant nodded, then said something I would never forget. "Your daughter has one of the sharpest minds I've ever worked with. But more than that, she knows how to carry weight without making others feel it. That's rare. That's leadership." I watched my father absorb that, not as a compliment to repeat later, but as a truth he hadn't considered until now. He looked at me like he was seeing something familiar and unfamiliar at once. We finished the evening with laughter and second helpings of dessert. It didn't feel formal. It didn't feel forced. It just felt honest. As the general said her goodbyes and my parents thanked her again, I stood back and let it happen. It wasn't about pride anymore. It wasn't about rank. It was about them seeing the life I'd built through eyes no longer clouded by who they once thought I should be. The cafe was quiet the way it usually was just before the lunch rush. I had the corner table by the window, the one with the chipped wood and the view of the crosswalk just outside the Pentagon entrance. My coffee had gone lukewarm, untouched, because I couldn't stop reading the letter in my hands. It was handwritten, the edges soft, the paper heavier than it needed to be. General Grant's script was neat but not stiff. She had written it just before stepping down, and it arrived in my mailbox, wrapped in an envelope with no return address, just my name. She started by thanking me, not for a mission or a briefing, but for being someone she could trust. She wrote that I reminded her of herself when she was younger but calmer, more deliberate, less caught up in needing to be seen. She told me that power isn't about how loud your voice is, but how steady you stay when no one's listening. That in rooms where rank matters, presence matters more. That I carried both. I read those lines 3 times, not because I didn't believe them, but because I finally did. There was something quiet in the way she said it. No praise, just recognition. She ended with a line I will never forget. The right path doesn't need to be crowded. It just needs you not to give up. Outside, people moved quickly, briefcases and handphones pressed to ears, names I would never know heading to meetings I might once have sat in. I watched them pass, but this time, I didn't feel behind or outside of it all. I didn't feel like someone left out. I folded the letter and slipped it back into its envelope, tucking it into the side pocket of my bag. It didn't need to be framed or displayed. It had already done what it was meant to do. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was carrying something alone. I wasn't chasing approval or waiting for someone to see the path I had taken. I just sat there steady the way I'd been taught, the way I had learned to become. And in that moment, with the city rushing past and the light softening through the window, I knew. I hadn't chosen wrong. I had just chosen differently, and finally that felt like enough. For a long time, I thought I wanted recognition. I thought if my parents could just say they were proud, if Chris could just admit I'd done something worthwhile, it would be enough. But standing in that conference room, wearing my rank on my collar and silence on my face, I realized something else. What I needed was never praise. It was understanding. I wanted to be seen without having to explain myself. Not the version of me they expected, not the daughter who followed the plan or the sister who came home with boxes checked. Just me. Who I was, who I'd chosen to become. I had carried that quiet hope for years, packed it beside my boots, tucked it into my letters, poured it into every unanswered photo I sent. It never arrived the way I imagined, but slowly it began to show up in smaller ways. My father now calls sometimes, not to give advice, but to ask if I have a few minutes to explain a new security article he read. He listens, he takes notes. He says things like that actually make sense. And he means it. My mother sends short emails, no long paragraphs, just a few sentences. Saw a report about cyber attacks in Asia. Thought of you. Hope your team's safe. She attached a recipe last week for an oatmeal cookie she used to burn. She wrote, maybe this time I'll get it right. Chris sent me a draft of a proposal last month, asked if I had feedback, said he wanted to make sure it held up from a technical security lens. He didn't say it to impress me. He said it because he trusted me. None of them got perfect, but they got honest. And that's what I needed more than anything. One Saturday, I came home late from work. The apartment was quiet, the windows open, soft air moving through the curtains. I walked past the framed article on the wall and into the kitchen where a small box sat on the counter. Inside was a hand-drawn card from my niece. Crayon scribbles a tiny girl in a blue uniform with sparkles taped around the edges. On the back, she had written her name and the words, "My aunt saves the country." I smiled without meaning to. Not big, just enough. I sat down with the card in my hand and let the room settle around me. The light was low. The air smelled like cinnamon from something a neighbor had probably baked. Outside, a dog barked. Nothing profound, just the sound of life moving forward. It wasn't perfection, but it was something real. And maybe after everything, that was all I ever needed. Not to be praised, just to be understood.